Here we are in part 2 of our metabolism lectures. We're going to be looking at the nucleotide ATP, and also we're going to be examining some information about metabolism and reactions. So first things first, let's define metabolism. Metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions that occur inside of a cell. When we say chemical reactions, we mean those reactions that are usually, though not always, but usually orchestrated by enzymes. And those chemical reactions include things like bringing two or more reactants together to make a larger molecule, in other words, dehydration synthesis. Or it can mean taking a large macromolecule and breaking it down into individual monomers, which is called hydrolysis. So in these cases, when you're looking at the sum of chemical reactions in a cell, or when you're looking at the metabolism of the cell, you're going to be using words like reactants. Those are the individual molecules that are going to be involved in the reaction. And you're going to be looking at things like products. Those are the end result of the metabolism or the chemical action. So let me give you an example here. Cells very commonly utilize and create ATP all the time. So imagine if you've got a cell here, and inside of that cell are these molecules of ATP. You will remember that ATP is an example of a nucleotide. ATP stands for Adenosine Triphosphate. There's the word right there. Oops. See here. There we go. Adenosine triphosphate, meaning it is a nucleotide with 3 phosphate groups attached. Now remember, a nucleotide contains a sugar group, a nitrogenous base, and at least 1 phosphate. In this case, adenosine triphosphate has 3. Now, let's imagine, for example, that we want to break apart the bond right here between these 2 phosphate groups, which is a very unstable bond because there are partial negative regions on both these phosphate groups, and those partial negative regions repel each other. So it would be very easy to break off this phosphate right here and release it. And when we do that, when we break apart a chemical bond, we can utilize that energy to perform some sort of activity. Okay, so we can utilize that energy by stripping off that phosphate. Okay, that would be an example where we have a reactant, adenosine triphosphate, and our products of the reaction are 1 loose phosphate molecule by itself and adenosine diphosphate, now called diphosphate because only 2 phosphate groups are present. Because energy is released, in this case in the form of heat and in the ability to perform work, we would call this type of reaction an exergonic reaction. Exergonic reactions are reactions which give off heat or energy. Okay? In other words, one of the products of an exergonic reaction is heat or energy. Now, as I said previously, cells utilize ATP all the time. They take off that phosphate group, and the energy that's released from that broken chemical bond is used to perform actions inside the cell. Now that cell has adenosine diphosphate and this phosphate group floating around by itself. It turns out that the cell can actually take that adenosine diphosphate, or ADP for short, and it can reattach that floating phosphate group to remake ATP. And it does that by utilizing energy it gets from other places, such as from breaking apart the bonds of a glucose molecule, and that's what we're going to be talking about later in this lecture. So I have to utilize energy to force that phosphate group to rebond with ADP, and by doing that I create ATP. This is an example of an endergonic reaction. Endergonic reactions consume energy in order to produce a product. So in this case, you would see heat on the left side of the equation. So for example, you would write it like this. An endergonic reaction would be ADP plus inorganic phosphate plus energy yields ATP. That's an endergonic reaction. Notice that the energy is on the left side of the equation, to the left of the arrow. By comparison, let's do what the exergonic reaction would look like. Exergonic would be ATP yields ADP plus PI plus energy. Notice in this case that the energy is on the right side of the arrow. That's an exergonic reaction. Okay, so again, let's remember what ATP is. Remember, it's a nucleotide. I already mentioned that. Okay, and and that it can be utilized to perform a number of types of work inside the cell. We can use the energy stored in that phosphate bond to perform chemical work inside the cell. Maybe I want to convert one type of molecule into another type. Like maybe I want to take two amino acids and join them together to start making a polypeptide chain. That's chemical work, and I would use ATP to power that work. Maybe I want to move something across the plasma membrane from one side to the other using active transport. I would need to use ATP to do that. Maybe I want to cause a cell to contract, like a muscle cell to contract, so that I can lift a weight. That would be an example of utilizing ATP to perform mechanical work. All right. Hang on to your hats. Our next part of the lecture, we're really going to start getting into the details of how ATP is utilized in reactions, and it's going to get a little bit more complex. See you then.